Hi, it's Llarold. Today I'm going to talk about Murozond's Rise, which was nerfed this week. So let's just start with the obvious point here. This is the hardest dungeon. This season? Absolutely. Of all time? Yeah, probably. I haven't spent too much time thinking about it, but Cathedral of Eternal Night from Legion is the only close contender in my memory, and that was very early on in the lifespan of Mythic Plus dungeons when they hadn't really figured out the formula yet. So for this dungeon to be where it is, definitely stands out as being the hardest dungeon in recent memory. There are three main reasons why this dungeon is so hard, and I want to quickly cover them before talking about the changes. So here goes. 1. The dungeon is too big. There's just too much of it. It's built like a maze with lots of time spent navigating a gauntlet or riding back and forth between bosses, backtracking, and taking slow-moving transports from zone to zone. Ultimately, you spend as much time walking through the dungeon, like just walking, whether you're doing a +2 or a +30. You can't walk faster. This dungeon also has a lot of RP. It wastes a ton of time with unskippable conversations. Same deal here. Whether you're doing a +2 or a +25, the amount of time that the NPCs spend talking to each other is the same. And finally, it does way too much damage to players. It's just too hard. So now let's take a look at those changes. Alright, so let's actually look at these nerfs to the dungeon here, and these were dropped about a day and a half ago. It's the time I'm recording this, 2 days ago, probably by the time this video's out. So in terms of trash being nerfed, there were really only 4 types of mobs that were nerfed. The 3 mini-bosses on the first platform have all received 17% health reductions, which is pretty good. Valo, the guy who punches the ground and puts a shield out, that was the only thing that was nerfed on him. Llarold, the Time-Sworn Maiden, the big, she looks like the boss Oriya. I don't know, one of those big ladies made out of like metal robots. She casts this Ancient Radiance Pulse. She would do it twice every 15 seconds. It was quite a lot of healing for a healer to have to keep up with, especially on fortified weeks. And then if there's any sort of overlapping affixes, they got to get out of an entangle. They got to dispel afflicted. Like that would really almost always cause people to die on higher level keys. So they've cut that damage by 50%, basically half as many explosions of damage. You know, that's a pretty substantial nerf to a really dangerous boss right at the start of the dungeon, which is a good thing, I think. You know, a lot less likely to just immediately crater groups there. And then Spurlock, the Time-Sworn Sentinel. This is the guy who jumps out and does Binding Grasp. He puts a swirly circle around him. Somebody, the tank, has to run in and interrupt it, and then he'll walk out. They increased the cooldown of this from 19 seconds to 23, so ultimately one person was kind of responsible for kicking this every 19 seconds. Well, there's no interrupt cooldown. I mean, all of the interrupt cooldowns other than Shaman are 15 seconds, Shaman are 12. So there's not really any way that, like, if you're on a 19-second rotation, you're locked in on that one. You can't then interrupt something else and then also get this guy. That's still the case with a 23-second interrupt timer. It would have to go up to some multiple of 15 seconds, like 33 seconds, for you to be able to interrupt this guy and then also interrupt something else and then come back and still be able to lock in on this guy. So I really think that this change does basically nothing except that he jumps out of melee range a little bit less often, and that's good. I mean, I guess it's about 20% less often. He was doing it every 20 seconds-ish. Now it's every 23, so, you know, a little bit more time where he's just standing still and letting you hit him. That's good, but that's not a huge change. Then the other nerf to trash was just the Infinite Rift Mages, which are part of, what are they? They're part of the Sand Room. They cast 2 spells. One is just sort of a direct damage effect, and then the other is Infinite Burn, this damage over time effect that also is a slow. Healers would dispel this, or, you know, you can just interrupt it. It was a pretty spammy cast every 7 seconds. Now it's every 16. That's it for that big sand room. They didn't nerf any of the dogs. Most notably, they didn't nerf the robot in the Time Lost Battlefield room, which is pretty surprising. Now, as for bosses, they nerfed Tyr's Barrier. I actually think this is the only problem with the Tyr fight. Like, I think for the most part, the mechanics of that fight are actually pretty good and kind of fun. I like the way that you move them around the room. I like the way that you have to bait the cones in their correct direction and do the slams. All of that stuff's pretty good. The only real problem I had with this fight is that he spam casts a barrier on himself, or repeatedly casts a barrier on himself. And yeah, cutting that down by 15% at least is a good change, because the amount of time that you spend in this fight on higher level keys can be pretty irritating. Again, especially right at the start of a dungeon, to have just this insanely annoying wall boss who's shielding himself over and over again for massive amounts of damage reduction is very irritating. So I think they could have even gone further than this, but that's okay. Then in the Time Lost Battlefield, which usually is done as the second boss, the boss now moves even slower while channeling Blade Storm. It was 33%, now it's 50% slower. That is basically the difference required for just regular players just walking away and not, they don't have Tiger's Lust, they don't have some sort of move speed bonus, they just walk away, and that is enough to get them away from the boss casting Blade Storm. Now there are still like some mechanical overlaps. If you get storming or entangling overlapping, that maybe can still wind up with people getting stuck in the Blade Storm and killed, but I think that's way less likely now. And that's a good thing, because I definitely saw some players, some less mobile classes, warlocks, getting stuck in the Blade Storm and either needing basically like a Blessing of Protection or a Lay on Hands to not die. Battle senses, Thirst for Battle. These are, just basically color-coded depending on whether you're fighting Lothar or Grom. It's basically just he auto-attacks and it does group-wide damage. It's incredibly boring. He gets it for killing the NPCs around the zone, which you can't really prevent because of the way Shockwave and Blade Storm work. He's going to be killing NPCs. He's going to be getting stacks of these buffs. He's going to be doing just random, incredibly boring damage to the group. So nerfing this is kind of good. I think this sort of mechanic where a boss just pulses damage, it's so boring. It's not really even interesting for healers. It's certainly not interesting for anybody else. And less of a reliance on this and more of a reliance on things that are targeted and like counter playable, I think it's good for Mythic Plus. So this is at least a good change. And then finally we have Chrono Lord Dios, who I think prior to these nerfs was top 3 most deadly bosses in the game for tanks. Honestly, more so even than like Mythic raid bosses once you get to a certain Mythic Keystone level. And this is a pretty substantial nerf to his primary tank killing ability, Temporal Breath. It is exactly what you would think, Frontal Cone Breath. It does a massive amount of damage up front, and then it does a very significant dot over the next 10 seconds. That dot has been nerfed by almost 30%, and the initial hit, 16.7%. Very weird number to go with, but all right, fine. Great change. This isn't the first time they've nerfed this either. I think the previous nerf was about 20% to the initial damage and periodic damage, something like that, a couple of months ago. And at that point, I was like blown away by how much damage it did back then. So this is now 2 rounds of nerfs into this very irritating breath. I'm glad to see it happen. Chronal Burn is just like a damage over time effect he puts onto people. It just does slightly less damage now. That's a good change. And then Infinite Blast is, if I remember correctly, it is the damage that the adds he summons out of his portals throughout all of phase 1 cast onto players, specifically the tank. It trucks, it hits pretty hard when you have those going and you have the boss breathing on you as the tank and you have the boss auto attacking. To have also these infinite blasts popping off is pretty nasty. So nerfing that is good as well. But notably, all of these are nerfs to damage or to health just on these mini bosses and to your shield. And that's it. Those are the only changes happening. Just basically reducing the difficulty of actually staying alive in all of the encounters in the dungeon, other than Morchi. Morchi totally untouched, and I think that's fine. I think she was pretty much a good, totally fine boss. No changes really needed there. Now let's talk a bit more about what's wrong with this dungeon and why these changes don't exactly fix it. There was a great post on Reddit a few weeks ago by user Pieman911 detailing the ways in which this is the hardest dungeon ever. Basically, the success rate of Murozond's Rise, that is, the rate at which people time the dungeon, was 75% on the best possible push week according to bestkeystone.com, an aggregation website that compiles keystone data. The next hardest dungeon, at least in Dragonflight, was Halls of Infusion at 80%. Then the rest of the dungeons in Dragonflight were 85% and up. That is a massive difference. Here's another metric that's maybe a little easier to appreciate. At the time of Pieman's post about 3 or 4 weeks ago, no one had 3-chested a plus 21 or higher of Murozond's Rise. Not one group. 0. My channel manager could not believe this. We went through hundreds of pages of time keys on Raider.io to confirm. It's absurd. Well, guess what? I went through that same list just a minute ago, and it's still true. Also, at the time of PyMad's post, there were only 2 groups that had even 3-chested a plus 20. That number's up to like 33 now, which is still extremely low considering how many people have done this dungeon. Those groups that plus 3-chested a 20 were ranked like 155,000 overall. So people are absolutely running this dungeon, it just has an insanely tight timer. All the way back in November, I put out a video saying that I thought Murozond's Rise needed its timer increased by about 3 to 5 minutes. Then a week or 2 later, Blizzard increased it by 1 minute. Not good enough. I said that at the time and I have been vindicated. I also said Blizzard would wind up revisiting the timer and extending it further after a few more weeks, and that has not come true, but it should have because this dungeon is too long. So here's the issue, the third problem, the actual difficulty of completing the dungeon without wiping and giving up. That was primarily caused by how much more damage this dungeon deals than every other dungeon at its key level, and this set of changes that was dropped this week does solve that issue. Unfortunately, Blizzard completely ignored problems 1 and 2, both of which concern the dungeon's timer. The timer is too tight, the RP is too long, the dungeon is too big. You can't really fix the size of the dungeon, but you can certainly change the timer or remove the RP. None of those problems have been solved at all. So even though the dungeon is easier to finish now, it's really not significantly easier to time. Reducing the mini-boss's health on the first platform and Tyr's shield value are both good changes, but they're really not focused at this particular problem. It's a bit like slapping an ice pack on a broken arm. It doesn't exactly get the job done, but I guess it helps a tiny bit. The dungeon timer needs an increase. Just for quality of life alone, the RP should be reduced or removed. The tank trash mob before the second boss is still an unholy killing machine, and it was just totally left untouched. In talking with my channel manager about this, we both agreed that the most alarming issue with all of the tuning surrounding Murozond's Rise is how long Blizzard has left it untouched. Like, if the metrics that they used internally that indicated this dungeon needed to be nerfed again were there, why wait? What was the reason for spending several months leaving it like it was to then put out this nerf? The holidays maybe make sense as a reason for delaying until 2024. People are on vacation, can't really work while you're out of town, but we're several weeks past the end of the holiday break, so I don't really think that explains the timing all that well, and this isn't a new problem either. Community members have been complaining about Murozond's Rise being overtuned since like November, so why now? I don't have an answer, I'm just asking this question. I don't know. So let's wrap up with the most important question here. Was Murozond's Rise fixed by these nerfs? I don't really think so. It's definitely less painful, it sucks less to do, but I still think it's a contender for worst dungeon of all time. Maybe Blizzard will hit it with even more nerfs, but given the rate at which they're responding to feedback on this dungeon, I wouldn't be surprised if this is all we get. If that's the case, I sincerely hope this dungeon is not part of Season 4. As much as I like Galakrond's Fall, and I kind of expect them to be bundled together, I would just be willing to lose out on it not to do Murozond's Rise anymore. It is still a really bad dungeon. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.